There is a kind of dark that only stands over deep water. It has no edges and no bottom, and it does not care whether you are looking at it or not. Out on Carrick Rock, as one man learned in a single winter, that dark keeps a light of its own, and it wants you to answer it. Good evening. Let me settle in beside you before we go out onto that water, because this is a story that likes the cold. I'm the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry alone for years, the ones they will only tell you with the sea in their voice, and I sit with them until they make a kind of sense. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent one winter as a relief keeper on a rock lighthouse, and who never in his life took another posting near the sea. So pull the blanket up, and let me tell you about a tower, a fog, and a light that had no business shining. The man at the heart of this had gone to the sea the way a lot of men go to hard work, because the wage was good and the questions were few. He had kept lights before, on the mainland heads where you could at least see a farmhouse across the fields. When the board offered him a relief posting on Carrick Rock for the worst of the winter, they told him plainly that the last 2 men had asked to be taken off early, and that the pay was doubled for a reason. He told them he liked his own company. He would come to understand, out on that rock, that there is being alone, and then there is being kept company by something that only pretends to have gone. Carrick Light stood on a bare fist of black rock a good 3 miles off the coast, in a stretch of water that the charts marked with more wrecks than soundings. It was a tall gray tower, older than the board that ran it, with a curl of iron stair inside and the great lamp turning at its crown. There was no island to speak of, only the rock, and the landing steps green with weed, and the tower, and the sea on every side, reaching out flat and gray until it met the fog. The keeper would live in the rooms stacked one above another inside the tower itself, with the sea below his window and the light above his head. He was rowed out on the last calm afternoon of that December, and I want you to picture the crossing, because he described it to me more than once. The boatman was an old man from the fishing village on the head, and he pulled at the oars in a hurry that did not match the flat calm of the water, as though he wanted the errand done before the light failed. He said very little the whole way out. Only once, when the tower was close enough to throw its shadow across the boat, did he speak at any length, and what he said, put into my own words, was this: "Keep the lamp lit whatever else you do, and if ever you see a light out on the water that you do not know, a light that is not a ship and is not a star and is not this tower's own, you are to leave it be. You are not to signal it. You are not to answer it, no matter what it seems to be asking." The keeper took that for an old man's superstition, the way sailors will hang a story on every rock, and he thanked him and climbed the weeded steps with his bag on his shoulder. The boat was already pulling away before he reached the door. Inside, the tower was plain and solid and smelled of paraffin and cold stone. There was a stove and a narrow bunk and a table, and above them the iron stair winding up to the light. On the table lay a heavy brass key and a leather logbook worn soft at the corners by the hands of every keeper who had ever sat where he now sat. The board standing orders were pinned to the wall: trim the lamp at dusk, keep the light through the night without fail until dawn, wind the mechanism every 4 hours. Log the weather, the passing ships, and anything out of the ordinary. He read that last line and thought nothing of it, and set about lighting the lamp for his first night, and the great light woke and began to turn, throwing its slow arm out across the darkening water. He stood a while at the gallery rail, high up under the turning light, and watched the coast lose its last color and go black. The sea below was very quiet, and for that first night at least, there was nothing out on the water but the dark and the far cold stars and the steady sweep of his own light going round. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. He kept the light well for the first few nights, and I want to be fair to him about that, because it matters to what came after. He was a good keeper. He trimmed the wick and wound the weights and logged the weather in a small, neat hand, and by day he slept, and by night he sat up under the turning lamp with the sea all around him, and he began to think the doubled pay was the easiest money he had ever earned. The fog came in on the 4th night. It came the way fog comes on that coast, not rolling but simply arriving, so that the coast lights on the mainland were there at dusk and gone by full dark, and the world shrank down to the rock, and the tower, and the gray wall of it pressing on the glass. His own light still swept round overhead, but now it lit nothing but the fog, a slow wheel of paleness turning in the murk. He logged it and settled in, and listened to the foghorn far down the coast lowing every minute like a lost animal. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning, at the low turn of the tide, that he first saw the other light. It was out on the water to the west, where he knew for a fact there was nothing, no head, no buoy, no other tower for 30 miles. It was low and yellowish and small, and it did not sweep the way his own light swept. It simply glowed there in the fog, steady for a moment, and then it dimmed, and then it brightened again slowly, as though someone were turning a lamp up and down by hand. He stood at the glass and watched it, and told himself it was a fishing boat that had lost its way in the fog and was showing a light to be seen. But a boat would have moved. This light did not move. It hung in the same place off the western rocks, hour after hour, glowing and dimming, glowing and dimming. And after a while he noticed the thing that put the first real cold into him. It was keeping time with his own light. Each time the great lamp above him came round and threw its beam to the west, the little light out on the water brightened to meet it, as if it were answering. And each time his beam swept away, the little light sank down again to almost nothing, and waited. He watched it until the fog thinned toward dawn and the little light faded with the dark, and then he wrote in the log, in his small neat hand, that he had observed an unidentified light to the west, and he left it at that, because to write down what it had seemed to be doing would have made it a thing that was happening. The next night the fog held, and the light came again at the same low turn of the tide in the same place, and the night after that. It was never there in clear weather. It came only with the fog, and it came always at 2 in the morning, and it always answered his light, brightening when his beam found it and sinking when his beam passed on, patient as anything, as though it had all the time in the world and was only waiting for him to understand what it wanted. On the third night of it he could not keep from doing the thing you would have done, the thing anyone would have done. When his own great light swung away to the east and left the west in darkness, he took up the small signal lamp that hung by the gallery door, the one the keepers used to answer passing ships, and he thought that he would simply show it once, a single flash to see. And his hand was on the shutter of it when he remembered the old boatman in the boat, and the thing he had said with the tower's shadow across his face. You are not to answer it. He stood there a long moment with the cold lamp in his hand and the little light glowing and dimming out on the black water, waiting, and something in the patience of it frightened him more than any sudden thing could have. He put the signal lamp back on its hook. And out on the water, as his great light came round again, the little light brightened once more to meet it, and went on waiting. He told himself through the next day that a light was only a light, and that a man alone on a rock in the fog will make a companion out of anything, even a thing to be afraid of. But that night he could not settle, and somewhere in the small hours he heard, for the first time, the sound on the stair. It was a slow, heavy, climbing sound, a booted foot on iron and then another coming up the spiral from the rooms below him toward the light. It was the sound a tired man makes climbing to relieve the watch, and there was no other man on the rock. He sat very still at the table with the log open in front of him and listened to it come. The steps did not hurry and did not falter. They came up past the storeroom and up past the oil room, with the slow patience he had already come to know from the light on the water, and then they were on the last flight below him, and he could hear, under the tread of them, a sound of water, of something wet, dripping, moving, as though the man on the stair were climbing up out of the sea itself and bringing it with him. He got up, and he made himself go to the head of the stair, and he looked down. The spiral fell away below him into the dark, lit only by the small lamp on the wall, and there was a figure on it, 3 turns down, climbing. It was a man in a keeper's oilskin, black and streaming with water, his head bowed under the weight of the climb, one hand on the rail. The keeper could not see his face. He could only see the water running off the man in a steady thread, and hear the boots on the iron, and feel the cold coming up the stairwell ahead of him like a draft from an open door in winter. He said something, he never could tell me what, and the climbing stopped. The figure on the stair went still, 3 turns down with its head bowed and the water running off it. And then slowly it began to lift its head, to turn its face up toward him. And he did not wait to see it. He went back up into the light room and he shut the trap over the stair, and he stood with his back against the lamp housing in the warmth of the turning light until the window grayed toward morning. When at last he found the courage to lift the trap and go down, the stair was empty, but every iron step from the bottom of the tower to the top was wet, in a single winding trail of seawater, as though something had climbed the whole height of the tower in the night and left the sea behind it. He followed the trail down with a lamp, his heart going hard, and it led him all the way to the door at the foot of the tower, the heavy door that he had barred himself from the inside at dusk, and that was still barred. He went back up, and he sat by the stove until it was full day, and then he did the only sensible thing left to a man in his position. He took down the old logbook, and he began, at last, to read it. The logbook of Carrick Light went back many years in many hands, and most of it was the ordinary business of the sea, the weather, the passing ships, the endless winding of the lamp. He read it backward, from the last entries toward the first, looking for the thing he was afraid he would find, and near the middle of it he found it. There had been a keeper on the rock, years before, a man who had kept the light alone through a long hard winter much like this one. And the story of him, as the keeper pieced it together from the entries in that man's own hand, and from what the boatman later told him, put into my own words, was this. That keeper too had seen a light in the fog to the west, where no light should be. He too had watched it come night after night at the turn of the tide, glowing and dimming, answering his own. But he had not been warned, or he had not listened, and so one night, when the fog was at its thickest, and the light out on the water seemed to be signaling him, dimming and brightening in a rhythm, over and over, like a ship in distress begging to be seen, that keeper had believed it. He had believed there were men out there on the rocks in trouble, and he had taken up the signal lamp, and he had answered it. What the logbook recorded, in a hand that grew worse and more hurried with every line, was that the light had answered him back, that it had come closer, that out of the fog behind it, drawn on by the signaling, a real ship had come, a coaster running for the coast, her captain seeing 2 lights now where he should have seen one, and steering for the wrong one, steering for the little false light off the western rocks because it lay where he thought the safe channel lay. The keeper had realized too late what he had done. He had swung his own great light and sounded every warning he had, but the false light drew the ship on, and she struck the western rocks in the dark, and went down with every soul aboard, close enough that the keeper heard them in the water and could not reach a one of them. The last entries were barely writing at all. The keeper wrote that he could still hear them on the foggy nights out where the ship had gone down, that the little light had never left, and that on the worst nights it climbed, that it came up out of the sea and up the stair, wet and heavy, to sit with him, because he had answered it once and it would not let him be alone with it again. He wrote in the last legible line that a light that has drowned men wants only one thing, and that is for someone else to answer it too, so that the guilt might be shared and he might, at last, put it down. And then the entries stopped. The board had recorded in another hand that the keeper was taken off the rock in the spring out of his mind and did not live out the year. And beneath that, added later in the plain, careful hand of some keeper who came after and who had clearly read the same pages by the same failing lamp, was a single line of standing order that was in no board's rule book. It said, "The light to the west is not a ship. Do not answer it. Keep your own and let it call." He closed the book. Outside, the fog had come down again with the falling dark, and far off at the low turn of the tide, he knew without looking that the little light had come back to the water and was already glowing and dimming and waiting for him to understand what it wanted. And he understood it now. That was the worst of it. He understood it perfectly. The last night was the worst of them, and he knew it would be from the moment the fog came down, because it came down thicker than he had ever seen it, until the great light overhead lit nothing at all and the tower stood blind in a world of gray. The little light came early that night, and it came brighter. It stood off the western rocks, and it began, almost at once, to signal, not the slow glow and dim of the other nights, but a quick, urgent, rhythmic flashing over and over, the unmistakable begging of a light that wants to be answered. And as he stood at the glass and watched it, sick with knowing, a second light appeared in the fog beyond it. And this one was real. It was the steaming light of a ship, far out, feeling her way along the coast in the fog, and she was too far yet to be in danger, but she was coming on, and he understood the shape of the trap at once. The little false light was flashing to be seen, and if the ship saw it, if her master saw two lights and took the low western one for the tower marking the safe channel, she would steer for it and strike, exactly as the coaster had struck all those years before. The only thing that could save her was his own light, kept steady and true and unanswered, so that her master would know the one real mark from the false. And that was when the cold came up the stair. He heard the boots on the iron, wet and heavy, climbing, and he did not turn from the glass because he knew now what it was, and he knew what it wanted. It came up into the light room behind him, and it stood there, dripping, cold as the grave, and though it said nothing that a man could hear, he felt the whole weight of its wanting press on him like a hand between the shoulders. It wanted him to take up the signal lamp. It wanted him to answer the light on the water, as its owner had answered it once, so that the ship would come and strike and go down, and there would be 100 more souls in the water for company, and the guilt of it would be shared at last between two keepers instead of borne alone. It had waited on this rock for years for a keeper who would answer, and it had decided that he was the one. His hand, he told me, moved toward the signal lamp on its hook. He does not think he told it to. He said the wanting behind him was so old and so strong and so terribly reasonable, that the men were already dead, that the light only wanted company, that it would be so easy, one flash, and the loneliness of the rock would be over, that some part of him leaned toward it the way you lean toward warmth. His fingers closed on the cold brass of the lamp. Out on the water the little light flashed, and beyond it the ship's steaming light held steady, coming on, her 100 sleeping souls not yet knowing that their lives had come down to what one tired man on a rock did with his hand in the next long minute. What stopped him in the end was not courage, and it was not the memory of the boatman. It was the logbook. In that last moment some small, stubborn clerk in the back of his mind put up the single fact it had been holding all along, that every keeper who had answered the light was a keeper who had drowned men and been made to carry it forever, out here in the cold, wet and climbing and alone. And he understood, with the lamp cold in his hand, that to answer the light was not to end his loneliness. It was to become the thing on the stair. It was to stand where it stood, wet and begging for the next keeper, and the next, until the rock fell into the sea. So he did the hardest thing a frightened man can do, which is nothing. He put the signal lamp back on its hook. He turned his back on the cold that stood dripping behind him, and he took up his post at the great light, and he kept it, trimmed it, and wound it, and held it steady and true and turning through the whole black heart of that night, and he did not answer the little light on the water, not once, however it flashed and begged and raged. And it did rage. He told me the little light burned up bright and furious out on the western rocks, flashing faster and faster, and that the cold behind him pressed and pressed until the glass of the light room ran with water on the inside. But he kept his own light. And far out in the fog the ship's master, seeing one steady mark where the chart said one steady mark should be, and no second light he could trust, came on slow and careful and passed clear of the western rocks in the dark, and went on up the coast, and never knew a thing about it, never knew that his ship and every soul in her had lived or died by a stranger's hand on a lamp he could not see. Toward dawn the fog thinned. The little light on the water sank down and dimmed, and this time it did not brighten again. And the cold went off the stair. When the gray light came up at last over a flat and empty sea, there was nothing off the western rocks but the rocks, and the water washing white over them, and the long trail of wet on the iron stair was drying in the cold air, step by step, as though something had gone back down for the last time and not come up again. He kept the rest of his winter on Carrick Rock, and he never saw the little light again, and he came to believe, though he could never be sure, that a light which has waited years to be answered, and is not, may at last be allowed to go out. He thought that perhaps the keeping of a light is not only in the shining of it, that sometimes it is in the refusing, in holding your own steady mark through the dark, and letting the other one call and call and call, and never once answering it back. I've thought a good deal about why he told me all of this, and I think it comes down to the part he cannot leave alone, how close his own hand came to the lamp, and how reasonable the wanting was, and how the worst thing on that rock was never the cold man on the stair, but the moment he understood him and very nearly agreed. Because the light is still out there somewhere on the foggy nights, off some black rock on some cold coast, glowing and dimming at the turn of the tide, patient as the sea. And it is still waiting, as it will always wait, for a tired man alone in the dark to look out at it, and take pity and answer. That's where I'll leave him and leave you, with a lamp that stayed lit, and a rule that held, and 100 strangers alive on the water who never knew your name. Some things are kept safe only by the ones who refuse to answer them. If you'd sit up in the dark for a story like this, then do me a kindness before you go, like, share, and subscribe, so the next one finds its way to you when the fog comes down. Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning if you'd rather. And if you ever wake in the small hours to something out beyond the window, glowing and dimming, patient and slow, as though it has been waiting a very long time for you to notice it, do the hard thing. Keep your own light. And whatever it seems to be asking of you, however tired you are, however reasonable it sounds, don't answer it. Good night.